This is a talk by myself, Andrew Devey, about the Rodalquilar mines and their legacy, as requested by Andrew Mortimer, who I believe it's on behalf of the Middlesex University students. Just a little bit about myself. I'm actually a fifth generation miner, born in Wakefield, West Yorkshire back in 1956. I hold a mining surveyor certificate from 1978 and also a colliery manager certificate from 1984. I've been a chartered mining engineer since 1985, and I presented 2 papers to my institute back in the early 1990s. One about changing the culture in development drivages, and the second one about motivating men to achieve high achievements levels. And we actually broke the European record for coal production, for a week's coal production, back in 1992. I've also presented at international conferences in London and Wengen in Switzerland. In total, I've 24 years of experience within the UK mining industry at all levels, from being a coalface worker to colliery general manager, which was my position at the last 2 mines during the last 5 years of my mining career. I've subsequently recruited into the UK insurance industry for a 14-year period and worked as a special risk surveyor and also an industrial crime specialist for the Royal and Sun Alliance. We have a place in Almeria province, and I am fluent in Spanish. I'm the author of 7 books. 5 have already been published. 2 by Schiffer Military History back in 1999. A 3rd by Pods and Palace Verlag, which was a German edition of one of the original books back in 2001. Self-published twice, and I've got 2 books, one in English and one in Spanish, editions of the same book in the final stages of publication for this year. I've also done about 40 magazine articles, mainly on my other passion, which is solar astronomy. I am an outreach specialist in English and Spanish languages. Okay, just to give you the location, we're in the Almeria province in the southeast corner of Spain. The Rodalquilar mine is just to the east of Almeria, and I live about 25 miles geographically north, near a town called Bedar, also a mining area. I'm going to refer briefly to the geology of the area and not go into any great deal of complexity, but there's actually a volcanic caldera here centered on Rodalquilar, with the volcanism taking place between 15 and 7 million years ago, which in geological times quite recent. The surrounding light blue area is a volcanic caldera, and the green area in the center are igneous intrusions in the form of andesites. The early mining in the area started in the 16th century, and back in 1509, concessions of alum were granted by the then Bishop of Almeria to a fellow called Francisco de Vargas that started alum mining, which is a white crystal which I believe was used for assisting to get different coloured dyes into clothing. There was a pirate assault in the area back in 1520, which caused temporary cessation of activity, and then in 1565, the mines were seized by King Felipe II. 1575, resumption of regular activity, and then it definitely closed in 1590. The minerals that have been mined in this area are alum, which is a mixture of aluminium and potassium sulfate, lead and silver. They were combined in a compound called argentiferous galena, which is a lead ore, copper, gold, zinc, and also there's been some mines in the early 20th century mining cobblestones from the regular formation of the granite pillars. This is an impressive piece of gold within some quartz that you can see. To give you an idea of scale, it is 1 millimeter square, so it's micro photography there. This is one of the alum mines that I mentioned. It is located on the main road between Rodalquilar and, I forgot the name of it, Herrera, sorry, Las Horticuelas. And these date back from the 16th century. They remain untouched. You've got a typical excavation there marked in the red circle, which is where the quarries are. The white area is where they were doing the processing, and then the yellow area, typical tips. Just to give you an idea of the scale, this is Rodalquilar is the centre there in the red circle. And these are all the various mining concessions that have been registered over the centuries. The first extraction of the Argentiferous galena took place at Las Chicas, the young girls' mine, in 1864 and continued in the Ronde El Resto and La Consulta mines to the end of the 19th century. One of the problems is that the world market price of lead collapsed in the mid-1880s and it became uneconomical. After 20 years of rumours, gold was actually confirmed almost 20 years later in 1883 in the Las Chicas mines, and they found small flecks of gold running within, or particles of gold running in some rich quartz veins. That prompted a huge search for reserve sites in the surrounding areas. In 1924, there was also a platinum discovery, quote unquote, which set off a bit of a fever, and it turned out to be a scam. Typical mining activity, you can see the tunnel there, that's where they're pursuing one of the quartz veins. There's been about 100 mining companies that's passed through Rodalquilar in the 19th and 20th centuries. Mostly they were quite small local affairs where people bought a concession, mined as best they could to get what they could for sale. When it failed, they left. No forward planning, and it was quite a poor business sense. The Minister Rodalquilar arrived in 1929, 1930 with British capital, and that began a new era of mining. They introduced the first cyanide plants, leaching plants, which I'll come to later. Things stopped then during the 1936-1939 Civil War. Almeria was a big Republican area, and then after Franco won in 1939, the state seized the mines in 1940. The Minister Rodalquilar SA installed the Denver plant that was actually then opened by General Franco on the 14th of May 1956, and there's actually a video on YouTube. It runs for about 4 minutes. Quite interesting, obviously shot in black and white at that time, but they show you a decent tour of the mine, an explosion where they were blasting the rock face, and then a brief view of the mineral treatment. The mining operations, mainly on the large scale, they were open pit mines, and you can see a compressed air drilling rig. They were drilling 5-centimeter holes at specific distances apart, and they were blasting the rock using dynamite charges set on top of ammonium nitrate and diesel main charges. The tunnel that you can see there to the left was actually an access tunnel to allow them to dump the material, the sterile material that were getting in their way. The early transport systems, it was transported and extracted and either smelted on site, and then they used mules and donkeys. There weren't, we don't believe, any rails at that time in this area, but there were 2 aerial cables were installed at the beginning of the at the beginning of the 20th century. I don't believe there are any existing photographs. There's certainly none that I know of that area. In the 1930s, the areas underwent a significant expansion, and the small rural community jumped to about 1,000 people. This was the original door plant that was installed in 1930. That's a photograph of it in its heyday, and that introduced the first cyanide leaching process into the Rodalquilar mining operation, which I'll come to in a little bit more detail later. That's a photograph of the door plant, and also the steel tower is what we call a headgear, which is the winding arrangement situated over the top of the mining shaft. This particular one had 3 levels that were at a depth of 20 meters, 55 meters, and the deepest at 70 meters. And material came straight up there and were fed directly into the door plant. The first lorries were used in the 1950s, and there's an example showed there. Well, they were constructing a garage and workshop at the mine. The 1956 transport, they bought a fleet of Pegaso lorries. These were quite new revolution lorries at the time, manufactured in Spain, with a 15-ton capacity for mineral transport. You can see a front face shovel there on the lower left photograph filling the lorry after a significant blast that took place. The blasts were generally about 5,000 tons in capacity, and the right hand photograph you can see it tipping through what we call a steel grizzly to stop the lye lumps going down into the plant, and the receiving hopper had a 400-ton capacity for gold ore. The Denver plant, that was a substantial investment. It was owned and operated by Americans, and the initial investment was 600,000 pesetas, American dollars, back in the early 1950s, and Franco opened it in May 1956. I've put together there a schematic for you of how the plant works. I'm not going to go through in massive detail. Obviously, you're not mining students, but the incoming was a 400-ton hopper. There were clean water tanks. The mineral dropped into 4 ball mills, which is number 15 on the screen there. And basically, it's a bit like a washing machine drum, much heavier duty, with very large steel balls. As it keeps turning, it crushes the mineral into very fine powder. They then use a series of agitators, thickeners, air agitators, and then they introduced a cyanide solution from tank number 35 there. So if you go on a visit, keep away from tank number 35. You should be okay, because cyanide breaks down with sunlight, and there's certainly no lack of sunlight and ultraviolet light in the area where it's situated. Eventually you get a rich solution that comes out into the rich solution tank, which is number 22, and then they add zinc to precipitate the gold out. As I mentioned there, the plant was at a cost of $600,000, and it could treat about 250,000 tons of mineral per year. This is the remains of the excuse me. This is the remains of the treatment plant. It's a very substantial structure and remains a bit of an iconic on site. The cyanide principle in detail: crushed ore, that does freeze some gold which can be sieved out, but the only way really is to dissolve it with the cyanide and use feed air into it, or even oxygen, to get the gold into solution. The trick is to get all the gold into solution where it can be directed into the right place to be precipitated out using zinc to get a high level of purity. The guy on the right is Antonio Gallego Bermejo, who was a chief chemist for the PAF, which was the Precipitate, Refine and Smelter House of the Rodalquilar gold mines. Just to give you an idea of the scale of production, if you want to take a look at this graph during your leisure in high resolution, you can, but over between 1903 and 1990, a total of 555 ingots were cast, yielding just shy of 7 tons of gold. In today's money, the gold is trading on US dollars at about just over $1,800 an ounce. So that would have yielded just shy of $500 million US dollars over the century. So quite a substantial operation. One of the things about mining is an extractive source and a very finite commodity. So when the mineral is discovered, people come in, mine it. When it's exhausted, they disappear and often leave quite a mess behind themselves. Back in 1933, the area went from rural to about 1,000 inhabitants, and then by 1960, 1,345, and I think the highest were recorded at about 1,500, and it became the second largest population nucleus in the municipality of Níjar, which is just north of Almeria. When the mine closed in 1966, the population decreased to less than 100 inhabitants, and today I believe there are about 170. Mining diseases. The first mining disease identified was something called satanism, which is lead poisoning, and it's named after the Greek name for lead. That affected the miners in the 19th century from 1864 onwards, and it was something that's ingested by the body, damages the nerves and causes a gradual debilitation, or something that was known as miner's weakness in this area. The next major problem, which was also suffered by the early miners, was silicosis, which is ingestion of silica dust by the lungs, which retains and gradually destroys the lungs by causing large fibrous masses and eventually dysfunction of the lungs. Back in 1938, a 33-year-old miner called Juan Montoya Segura died of silicosis. He had only been working in the mines for 5 years, and when he died, he left a wife and 4 children that were all under the age of 10. This particular accident was subject to quite a substantial compensation case back in 1941. In the 1930s, out of the 120 underground miners, 10 of them died of silicosis, and a further 41 were rendered incapacitated and unfit for work. The problem was that the new rotary hammers that they had in the 1930s were compressed air fed. So yes, they were very, very good at drilling and also extremely good at generating dust. Later, water was introduced into the mechanism and the rotation, and that acted as a dust suppressant. Now, the other problem is miners don't like getting wet, so a lot of miners would prefer to put up with the dust rather than get soaking wet and walking about in mud. The actual water, if it was used together with dust mass, did create a significant decrease in cases of silicosis. By the time of the mine's closure in 1966, the mine employed 355 employees. Those with the families, if they all had a wife and a few children, you can see very quickly how once the mine had closed, 1,200 or 1,300 people suddenly left the area and left it all to be abandoned. So the mining legacy, which is what I believe your students will be more interested in. One of the major problems is land contamination, the contamination of soil, plants. The animals feed on the plants. You get regular goat herders, or paso de cabras as they're called here in Spain, that will take their animals across the contaminated area. And the worst offending agent is arsenic from the ore. There's lots of derelict buildings in the area. Most of the 1956 housing remains derelict. There are also open pit workings. Most of the tunnels are easier to access, and also in Spain, particularly the area where I live, is notorious for unmarked and unfenced mine shafts that can be up to 100 or even more meters deep. Quite a significant risk. The buildings have been used specifically for film sets for quite a number of major Hollywood movies. Just to name a few, The Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More back in 1965, which was one of the spaghetti westerns directed by Sergio Leone and starring Clint Eastwood. A sci-fi film called Solar Babies was shot in 1986. Part of the tunnel I showed you earlier was used in the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade film back in 1989, and also a new film called The Reckoning in 2003. The other thing is the area now is a huge area for tourism. There are mining and geology field trips, but there's also the Ruta Minera, which is the miners' walk, where it's quite a gentle walk where people come to visit and have a walk and have a look around the gold mine, and everybody expects to find gold, but you don't. There's also a significant museum and visitor centre in what was the old gold preparations / smelting building. Just to show you a few photographs here, this is Las Minas de Albayan, and that was significant investment back in 1929, and then it was expanded in 1932, which is the top right-hand photograph. And then some 80 odd years later, you can see the ruins of the building from the same perspective. Mine buildings tend not to last long, particularly if people are in pinching windows and robbing timbers from roofs, etc. Things tend to get reprocessed once they're abandoned, or the insects get in and very quickly rot the timber in this area. This is a beautiful panoramic view of El Cinto, which translates to the belt. This was the main area where they're extracting the gold ore, as you can see in the centre there. And that quarry actually features in the 1956 video where they do a blast, what General Franco and his huge entourage were able to witness. These are a few still shots from some of the Hollywood videos. I forgot to mention one earlier, the Hollywood 10 starring Jeff Godblum. That was filmed there back in 2001. There's a still from the Solar Babies there where they've got cell block A and B on part of the old preparation plant. It was converted into a castle in the Reckoning in 2003, and they even brought their own fake snow in to make it look realistic. And then the lower left is a picture of none other than Sean Connery and Harrison Ford from the Indiana Jones movie, where they travel through the refuse tunnel. There's been quite a number of environmental impact studies on the area, so I'll just mention some that I've had a look at for you, and there are the links on the internet there that you can do some background reading. But they've looked at characterization of the environmental impacts of the Rodalquilar mine site based on ground-based reflectance spectroscopy. There's also been an environmental assessment on the arsenic-rich gold deposits. there's been an impact of unconfined mine tailings and anthropogenic pollution on the semi-arid environment in the area, and also sustainable mining environmental assets analysis as well. This is a photograph of the scale model showing the Denver waste treatment plant. Beautiful model, which is in the building at the side of the real thing. But the area is now a national park, Parque Nacional Marítimo Terrestre de Cabo de Gata, which was in 1987. It was adopted as a UNESCO site in 1997 and a Geopark Europeo in 2006. I've put some links there for you to do some further reading, and these are the sources that I've used. The Cabo de Gata and Rodalquilar is not my prime area of research. I have actually used secondary source researchers here in this one. My own research, which is in for publication at the moment, is on the mines, cables, railways, foundries and mineral loading operations in the area where I live, which is Bedal, Los Gallardos, Garrucha, Mahaca and Torre. And I focused on the years between 1840 and 1970. I've worked together with my friend Juan Antonio as the co-author. I am the lead author, and the book is in for publication in both the Spanish and English languages. It represents over 20 years of combined research, mostly from primary sources. The book's design, I'm also the designer, I've been trained as the book designer as well, is 384 pages of large format, or some people call it tabletop format, coffee table format, sorry. There's almost 500 illustrations, many of which are previously unpublished, and the work is 156,000 words, and that's in each edition, the Spanish and the English editions. And fingers crossed, depending on COVID, it'll be out in print later this year. And it's the first book through Ares Editores that will be published in the English language by this Spanish publisher. Okay, that concludes my presentation for today. I do hope you found it interesting and that I've been able to, one, enthuse you for the area and also direct you into areas for further study. With that, thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you found it helpful. Thank you.